My first reaction to that very powerful, let's call it a very transatlantic speech, where it's clear that you've pointed out to what extent the Ukraine belongs to Europe. And that would be my first question. Does the Ukraine belong to what is the European Union today? Should it belong there?
It's up to its people. It is a choice for Ukrainians to make. And I think what we saw is that a majority of Ukrainians wanted that future. And their leader at the time said he would make good on that desire. And he gave every indication up until the last minute, last year, that he would sign, actually the year before, at the very end of the year, that he would sign the association agreement with the European Union in response to the aspiration of what seemed to be the majority of Ukrainians. And it was the fact that at the very last minute, he did an about-face that helped fuel the Maidan protests. So my sense is this is the desire of the Ukrainian people. And as I said, it's their choice. It's not Europe's choice. It's not America's choice. And it's not Russia's choice. It's their choice, provided, of course, they can meet the requirements of membership. And there's a lot to be done there. Now, in fairness, and as I also suggested, there clearly are communities of people in the east of the country who have deep and understandable and long-time affinities for Russia, ethnic Russians, but also ethnic Ukrainians who have deep ties of language, of culture, of history, who want to make sure that those ties remain and are respected and indeed are strengthened. And that is totally consistent with a European future as well for Ukraine. And arguably, maybe we should have done more work before the effort to sign the association agreement was done to show that these things were compatible. But the bottom line is, I believe that it's up to the Ukrainian people, and they've been pretty clear about where their future lies.
Thank you. Let's open the floor and go here, please. We get a microphone for you. There is a rule. I'm very strict on rules. Rule number 1, you say your name. Rule number 2, you have 1 sentence.
My name is Gabriel. I'm an MPP student from Mexico. And my question regards the nature or the role of public opinion in Russia in this crisis. I wonder to what extent could the domestic pressure on President Putin and his government turn the course of action of the Russian government? Because I do not understand how public opinion in Europe and in Russia can differ so much on the issue of what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me start the answer by saying that 2 days ago, Rossiya published a piece that was illustrated, and this is what the Russian people are reading every day or listening to every day. And the piece said that the new Ukrainian currency would feature a picture of Adolf Hitler, and it showed what this currency looked like. Now, we can laugh about that in a kind of tragic way, but that's just a tiny example of the extraordinary propaganda machine that President Putin has, unfortunately, done a masterful job in building, and that the Russian people are subjected to every day. If you look at public polling in Russia, for example, throughout the crisis, huge majorities of Russians, 80, 90%, didn't believe that there were any Russians in Ukraine, despite very compelling evidence to the contrary. And it's very hard, if any of us were fed a steady diet of this propaganda, not to be persuaded by it. Meanwhile, you have, most recently with the assassination of Mr. Nemtsov, a climate of fear that is emerging in Russia. And I think that's causing many of the most talented citizens to leave because they're afraid. You know, this will sound like a harsh statement, but I think unfortunately there is more and more truth to it. In our countries, in Germany, in the United States, you can challenge your government and win. In Russia, the perception is taking hold that if you challenge your government, you die. So in that kind of environment, it's not a total surprise that there is this huge disconnect between public opinion and narrative in Europe and public opinion and narrative in Russia. And what to do about that is a very big challenge. I think the other thing that you're seeing in Russia is as we saw in Ukraine, great dismay at corruption, public corruption. But precisely because this crisis has happened and President Putin has used it effectively, he's also managed to distract people from that. I think you just have to keep fighting fiction with facts and hoping that the truth over time begins to penetrate. And then, of course, the economic situation in Russia at some point, if it continues in this direction, will create pressure, I think, for change. But it's very, very difficult to deal with this kind of propaganda. In a sense, it's a throwback to the Cold War, but it's being done in a very, very sophisticated way.
Wow. Please.
Why is the US so interested
Yes, sir.
in improving? Oh, sorry.
Your name, one sentence.
Barankov. Why is the US so interested in improving democracy in Ukraine? I mean, wouldn't it be sufficient to care about democracy within US borders?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that our basic experience is that, you know, Tom Friedman, one of our writers, had a wonderful line a few years ago in which he said, if you don't visit the bad neighborhoods have a tendency to visit you. And so it's really not sufficient for us in the 21st century, when we're so interconnected, for there to be just a small island of democracies around the world and everyone else to be doing what they want in undemocratic ways, because inevitably that's going to affect us, whether we like it or not. And so as a general proposition, we have a real stake in terms of our own interests, never mind our values, in democracy taking root in different countries. I think that's all the more critical right within Europe, especially after the experience of the 20th century, when we know what happened when democracy was not the prevailing rule in all of Europe, and the incredible work that's been done since then to strengthen the foundation of democracy. To see that challenged so long after the events of the last century, I think gives us great, great, great concern. But as I tried to suggest, it's not just democracy itself. It's some basic rules of conduct that go to having a more stable, peaceful, secure, and in that context, prosperous international order. And those rules are being violated in Ukraine, and I think we have a stake in standing up and defending them.
Very good. You see, we have a very open and frank type of discussion.
Good.
I go back there. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Nicholas, you're a PhD student here at the Hertie School. My question is, can there be a diplomatic solution without a credible military threat?
Yeah.
Well, that's a tough one.
Here's the challenge. I think, in a sense, if you're playing on a military terrain in Ukraine, you're playing to Russia's strength, because Russia's right next door. It has a huge amount of military equipment and military force right on the border. Anything we did as countries in terms of military support for Ukraine is likely to be matched and then doubled and tripled and quadrupled by Russia. It has the ability to do that. It would be very difficult for us to do that. And then you may well get into an escalatory cycle that is hard to control and hard to predict. We're better off, I think, playing to our own strengths. One of those strengths is the economic strength that we have. And so the pressure that we've exerted on Russia economically, again, not to punish Russia, period, but to impose costs for its conduct in Ukraine and to try and get it to change course, that's a strength of ours. And we've seen the results combined with the fall in oil prices. One of the things that bothers me, though, I have to tell you, and I think it's reflected a little bit in the debate, and it's interesting, you hear this in Europe and you hear this in the United States, is there's a larger narrative. And yes, Ukraine has many deficiencies in governance, in its system, its own corruption, many other problems. It's working to correct them, but it's difficult and it's challenging. But why isn't Ukraine more of a cause? Why don't people care more about the abuse of the country, about the trampling of its sovereignty and territorial integrity, about taking the choice away from the Ukrainian people about their future. You know, you've had in the past the Save Darfur movement, where people were mobilized and energized. And you don't see that same kind of mobilization, energy, and passion about what's going on in Ukraine. And I think in part it's because the Russians have done a good job in muddying the waters, and we tend to be focused on the details. Have the Ukrainians made good on their commitment to move out of this town? Have the separatists made good on their commitment to stop firing in that town? And we lose sight of the bigger picture and the bigger principles that are at stake. And I think that's unfortunate because it's worth concentrating our minds at what's really at stake here and acting. But I don't think at the end of the day the solution is going to be a military one. It has to be a combination of pressure. We have to continue and do more to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, including militarily. But ultimately it's this combination of pressure and diplomacy that I hope will bring this to a conclusion.
Wonderful. We have one more question here, perhaps the last one, and then we have to wrap up. Please, Mike is coming.
Hello, my name is Nikias Wagner. I work for Gazprom, for a Russian company. You just portrayed Russian gas supply or energy as irreliable, or that there's a need for diversification. Are you aware that Russia or the Soviet Union has served gas to Europe for more than 40 years without a single interruption? That actually we were facing a transit crisis and never a supply crisis. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that what we've seen in Ukraine most recently is Russia very clearly using gas as a political tool to pressure and leverage the Ukrainians and to threaten supply disruptions in Europe in an effort to get the Europeans to press the Ukrainians to take a softer line. That's what I'm aware of. We have no desire to remove Russian gas from the market, but we think that what's been demonstrated by the use of gas as a political tool is that it's a mistake to be overly reliant on any one country in the energy environment, and that Europe has a strong interest in making sure it is not overly dependent on Russia or anyone else for that matter. But if gas were not used as a political tool and the mere threat is enough, you don't actually have to cut supplies. If you threaten to cut supplies, you can get the result that you want. If that's the way it's going to be used, then I think that's simply going to spur Europeans to be a lot more aggressive in looking for other sources, other routes, other suppliers.
Very good.
Thank you.
We take a question in the. There was a question in the back here, please.
Oliver Löffler, MPP program here. Friends of mine have been increasingly concerned about the future of the transatlantic relationship in the light of the spy scandal and dissatisfaction with the TTIP negotiations. How should I respond to them?
That's a tough question.
It's an easy one for you.
It's an easy. Look, it's interesting. We're working now, as you mentioned, on TTIP, and there are a lot of myths about what it would produce and some misinformation, and I think one of the obligations that those of us who support that effort have is to better explain it and to better help people understand some of the myths that have arisen, because what's going on is quite extraordinary. Right now, we're working in Asia on a new free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that, I believe, stands a very good chance of being concluded before the end of the year. And if and when it is concluded, it will cover 40% of world GDP, and it will facilitate trade with high standards, labor, environment, and other critical social issues. And it's going to fuel growth, and that in turn will create more jobs. And we're trying to work in a similar way on TTIP. Now, we already have a much higher base in Europe because of the relationships we have. But there too, when TTIP comes into play, if it does, you're going to be covering 70 to 75% of world GDP in these agreements that, again, raise the standard, not simply in facilitating trade, but making sure the way we trade and the obligations that are undertaken actually advance human dignity as well as human prosperity. So I think there's a lot at stake, and there's a very strong case to be made, but it's actually incumbent upon leaders to make it. We will always have frictions in our relations, and there will always be a crisis of some kind in the relationship. And you can go back and look at the history of this, and almost every decade there's been something. I wrote as a dissertation in a book about something Wolfgang will remember, but most of you are too young to even know about, which is the so-called Siberian pipeline crisis, in which, in the wake of Afghanistan, the United States tried to stop Europe from building a gas pipeline between Siberia and Europe. And ironically, the argument in my book was in favor of the pipeline, I say to my friend from Gazprom. Parenthetically, that book, when it was reviewed, which is a warning to all of you, someone said it's the kind of book that once you put it down, it's very hard to pick up again. So I don't recommend it to any of you. But this was just one of the many crises that we had in the alliance. So there's always going to be something. But if you look at what's happening every single day between our countries, from the United States perspective, for all of the talk of the rebalanced Asia, and maybe that was the wrong word to choose, and it's real because there is an incredible dynamism in Asia and we want to be part of it. Whenever we are looking for a partner to deal with challenges, to seize opportunities, to advance our security, to deepen our prosperity, the first place we look is still Europe. That is where the most natural affinity lies. That is where we have a strong history of cooperation and a strong set of common values despite disagreements over things, including over the issue of the NSA program. And so I think when you look at those fundamentals, when you see that we're doing more business together than ever before, that more and more students are spending time in our respective countries, that more and more people are traveling back and forth, that we're more connected on a minute-by-minute basis than we've ever been in our history, to me, that is a tremendous source of strength and great evidence that the relationship, for whatever the clouds of the moment, is one that is really mostly blue skies.
What a beautiful word of conclusion. We have to end. My last question is, when you will be back in 10 years, where will Ukraine be? One sentence.
One sentence. Tony Blinken, Ukraine in 10 years, I think, will be a increasingly thriving part of Europe.
Very good. We keep it here. Thanks you very much. My thanks go to the embassy, Mr. Melville, go to the entire team of the State Department, to my dear colleague, Wolfgang Ischinger, and to you, Deputy
Dean,
Secretary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.